Now it's time for perspective, and the COP30 talks have come to an end at the weekend. The result perhaps best summed up, well, with the word subdued. Whilst more funding for countries to adapt to the wrath of extreme weather was agreed, there was no explicit details to phase out fossil fuels or strengthen countries' inadequate emissions cutting plans, which dozens of nations demanded. Well, joining us now is Director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. That's the German institute, seen as one of the world's top environmental think tanks. He's also Professor in Earth System Science at the University of Potsdam. Johan Rockström, thanks very much for being with us on the programme. The COP30 then, I mean, do you think it's been a failure?
Yeah, if you look at it scientifically, the conclusion must be nothing less than a failure, because we know that now 10 years after we signed the Paris Agreement, we're still increasing the emissions, we're still seeing an acceleration of temperature rise, and we're seeing suffering among hundreds of millions of people across the world already today. And we need to very, very rapidly bend the curve of emissions no later, strictly speaking, 2025, and reduce emissions by 5% per year globally. And this meeting was announced as the COP of truth and the COP of implementation, not any longer negotiate text, but rather focusing in on a work plan, on roadmaps for acceleration away from fossil fuels. And the meeting did not deliver that.
You mentioned fossil fuels. I mean, do you think that's the main thing? Is that the crux of it? And it hasn't even talked about, well, maybe talked about it, but nothing in the final communique.
Well, you know, 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions that are heating the planet to a point beyond which we may be undermining, livelihoods for billions of people across the world originates from fossil fuel burning. So the first thing we need to do is to phase out coal, oil, and gas. This is well known for decades, and still these negotiations that are set up to avoid dangerous climate change cannot address the key source of the planetary crisis we're facing, namely fossil fuel burning. So this is, of course, a huge paradox and an enormous frustration. This is why it was so reassuring that the Brazilian COP presidency decided to take the bull by the horn and start working on a roadmap for accelerating the phase out of fossil fuels, with monitoring, with finance, with responsibilities, with accountability, addressing specifically the oil and gas and coal industries. And still, this was not possible to achieve at the COP meeting. And we're running out of time. The remaining global carbon budget to be able to limit global warming within the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that is signed on into the legally binding Paris Agreement is soon disappearing. So we're at a point where we are at real risk of not being able to hold the 1.5 limit within reach, which is sprinkled across all the text coming out of COP. So everyone is kind of sending out false hopes in a way, not addressing the source of the problem, but still holding on to the wish of limiting warming to 1.5.
There are other sources of the problem, aren't there? I mean, there was some more funding for developing countries, but a lot of people saying that needed to be far, far bigger. Rainforest protection, bearing in mind this was on the edge of the Amazon, was hardly mentioned at all either.
No, this is, disappointment number two. It was a unique COP by placing it right at the heart of the Amazon rainforest. Scientifically, this is very significant because we know that it's not enough to only phase out fossil fuels to limit warming beyond, the dangerous level of exceeding 1.5. We also need to secure the carbon sinks in the big forest systems on planet Earth. 25% of the carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning is actually absorbed in the rainforest, in the temperate forest, and in the boreal forests. So a roadmap to protect forests and a roadmap to accelerate phase out of fossil fuels was on the agenda. That was the task for this COP, and neither of them came out in the final document.
Where did it go wrong? I mean, even before the COP started, the US weren't there, China weren't there. Perhaps one of them at least needed to be there to lead the charge, if you like. They were absent in the first place, so it meant the whole thing just kind of drifted?
Well, I mean, one should commend the Brazilian presidency. They did the best they could. They had a very good diplomatic effort of getting all the countries together in what they call the Muchirao, which was an effort of collective compromise building. China was there with a very constructive approach, showing that green technology and the phasing out of fossil fuels is a pathway to a stronger economy. Despite that, by the end of the negotiations, there was this unwillingness to really start moving away from fossil fuels. And it just proves again that you have the Arab states, China, but also big emerging economies like India that still are unable or unwilling to see the writing on the wall and truly move away from the status quo, which is the simplest way forward in their view, to just continue the energy provision as business as usual. So it's a very unfortunate situation of not seeing the crisis for what it is, but at the same time just hoping that they can sit still in the boat without too many consequences.
So as a climate scientist then, put this into words for the rest of us who perhaps aren't so invested or know so much about this. What does it actually mean for ordinary human lives? What does it mean for the ordinary civilian living in the world, this failure of this COP?
Well, the failure of this COP means that we are inevitably going to breach the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit within the next 5 to 10 years. We will then start increasing temperatures, at 1.6, 1.7. We're moving towards 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of this century. If we continue as today, as we sort of say, the consequence of a COP30 inability to start turning things around. The consequences of that is more droughts, more floods, more fires, more heat waves that are actually life-threatening to millions of people in the world, more human-reinforced storms. This will cost the global economy billions of US dollars. We will also be approaching tipping points, which means that the Amazon rainforest, tropical coral reef systems, the Greenland ice sheet may be crossing a tipping point somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius of warming. That would mean irreversible melting. It would not melt overnight, but it would not be possible to stop. And that's equivalent to 7 meters sea level rise. So we're talking big risks if we allow ourselves to continue on the dangerous path that we're following today.
Johan Rockström, good to talk to you on the programme today. Thank you very much for being with us, Director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research there, joining us there from Germany. Thanks very much.